This is part one of a lecture about postmodernism, the return of expression. So one of the strongest advocates of the international style was Wim Crowell, if you remember him from previous lectures. He became engaged in a long-running argument with another Dutch designer whose name was Jan van Toorn. And the argument came out of them embracing two separate styles. Van Toorn embraced a more personal style, one that kind of resembled Dada without rules or orderliness. And Crowell was sort of the opposite, and they first clashed in a public forum held to discuss Van Toorn's work. So Wim Crowell favored the constructivist concept of artist as engineer, so the grid, professionalism, visual problem solving, while Van Toorn wanted the designer to engage society critically, so sort of to bring about, again, the repoliticization of design, another hard word to say. So really it became this debate on the role of the designer, really became a consuming issue that under postmodernism, which we'll discuss in this chapter, really affected the work of the next generation of graphic designers. So this is Van Toorn's poster for an exhibition, and you can see he's using a heavy slab serif typeface. Some of the type is overlapping, some of the type runs vertically, and really this idea of overprinting was reminiscent of the expressive, rule-breaking Dada that kind of went against the grid and the stability of the international style. So at the end of the 20th century, saw a gradual breakdown of the dominance of the international style in the face of challenges that came about as part of the postmodern movement. And really all that postmodern means is just after modern. It's just that simple. And one characteristic of this movement is that it represented a break with that which was considered quote-unquote modern. So it really rejected the idea that a single concept or a single style can and should define a field. So you're going to see a lot of different design types in this chapter. So postmodernism questioned, reinterpreted, and deconstructed ideas that modern designers viewed as established truths. So going against things like Swiss style, international style, even the de-style movement. Postmodern designers and theorists viewed design as socially constructed, so kind of just going along with what was happening in the world, and saw the movement in a constant state of flux. And they really viewed the individual or the subject as working in collective rather than individually. However, many people whose work aspects of postmodernism did not really follow these theories, may not have even been aware of the broader changes occurring in the design world, so that's where this kind of becomes a little bit of a conundrum. So this created sort of this unstable definition of the stylistic convention. So, there wasn't really one style connected to the postmodern graphic design movement. So certain strategies had their roots in Dadaism, mixing type, mixing weight, overprinting, photo montage, really rejecting the rules of modern international style. But the modern movement did not end with the beginning of postmodernism, and they really both existed side by side for quite a while, and still to this day. So we're going to turn to psychedelic and rock graphics. And so alternatives to the international style appeared as early as the 1960s. And young designers began to really experiment with a bunch of different eclectic styles. Some created work that was self-conscious reaction to the international style, while other projects really just grew organically out of the social circumstances of the 1960s and beyond. And if you think about the 60s, you think about hippies, Woodstock, peace, free love, all that kind of stuff. So these designers where their work rose organically appeared around 1965 in San Francisco and the music scene. So the music scene really led this movement. But I do want to note that it's really impossible to understand postmodernism without recognizing the societal change that swept through Europe and the US beginning in the 1960s. So many of these designers actually didn't have formal training. And a group of poster designers, the ones in San Francisco doing the music posters, really developed an expressionist visual language that complemented the counterculture that was developing among young people. So there was this prevailing sense that their parents' lifestyles were boring. If you think about Leave It to Beaver, if you're old enough, or, remember Leave It to Beaver, the 50s, this whole idea of middle class and, coming home to mom in her apron and dad would come home with his briefcase. These designers really were kind of working against that. And young people in Europe and the US really succeeded in forcing a dramatic change in the way many people viewed the world. Another thing that kind of spurned this different design movement was psychedelic drugs. So if you think about the hippies in the 1960s, LSD played a big role in the formation of the counterculture. Drugs were legal in California until 1966, and it really became fashionable for artists and designers to sort of take a psychedelic trip. And to have their designs look like they're taking a psychedelic trip to appeal to young consumers. So these resulting posters, advertised rock concerts, really dramatically contrasted with the clarity and legibility that were the norm before this for graphic design of all types. So this is a poster done by Wes Wilson, and if you look at this typography, sometimes it's even like almost impossible to read, but it's very flowy. Almost harkens back to Art Nouveau. And this poster really sacrificed legibility for expressiveness. So they were kind of going for this visual punch. Wilson's poster, as well as the psychedelic design movement in San Francisco, brought about another aspect of postmodernism, which was the use of historicist styles. So at the University of California at Berkeley, they actually hosted exhibitions that highlighted early 20th century Expressionist and Art Nouveau styles, which I kind of mentioned in the previous slide. And this exhibition really had an impact on posters from the following years. So if you think of Alphonse Mucha, Jules Charest, even the McDonald sisters, the Vienna Secession, you're kind of seeing some of that type come back into play into these 1960s posters. So this is a poster designed by Victor Moscoso, and he was one of the few psychedelic designers who did have formal training in the visual arts. And he combined these beautiful hand-drawn lettering with these psychedelic colors and images, sort of in a photo collage technique, to make really beautiful original images. And this poster integrates the lettering into the forms of a pair of dancing hippies, whose movement almost has this kinetic force that kind of goes along with that typography and all of the abstract shapes. So this is a poster by Rick Griffin, and this is one of the most famous icons of the 60s and even into the 70s, this idea of the flying eyeball. So Wilson and Moscoso, along with Anton Kelly, Stanley Mouse, and Rick Griffin, really became known as the Big Five of psychedelia. They founded the Berkeley Bonaparte Agency to make poster art, so they really concentrated on posters. And this flying eyeball poster remains one of the most famous works produced by them, with the iconic flying eyeball. And if you look at the ligatures that kind of connect the lettering, almost makes it illegible. It's really interesting, and there's a movie that I'll share with you the link. American Artifact is all about these posters, and the poster designers used to say, if you couldn't read it, then you shouldn't go to the show. Like, if you couldn't read it and couldn't understand it, and if it turned you off, then you weren't meant to be there in the first place. Which brings us to the British psychedelic. So the psychedelic movement was not just confined to San Francisco, as a lot of artists adopted these styles, both in elsewhere in the United States as well as in Europe. So in the United Kingdom, Michael English and Nigel Weymouth pursued psychedelic graphics under the name Hapsash and the Colored Coat. I love these names. So this one was done by that group, and this was for Pink Floyd, and they really sought to express the sense of this drug-induced, dreamy reverie that was implicit in the band's music. You can see all these fantastical elements like the cherubs and the floating castles, the sky, really kind of reminiscent of Expressionism, symbolism, even almost into like surrealist And then you can really see in these posters, such with the curvilinear lines and the colors, gives an awareness of the Art Nouveau posters of Alphonse Mucha. So really both Art Nouveau and the psychedelic posters serve to publicize entertainment aimed at the young and daring. This is one of the most famous posters from the British psychedelic scene, and it was for the 1967 Love Festival by Michael English. This poster advertising the event became one of the icons of the psychedelic era in Britain, which I think I mentioned before I read that bullet point. So the poster designs then led to magazine designs and album designs, and makes you think of at the time. This was the beginning of the Rolling Stone magazine, came about in the 1960s. And Jan Wenner, he founded the magazine in San Francisco, and it was really the first publication to focus on the music industry. Wenner was one of the first people to recognize that rock music connected with broader themes of social and political values. So they really amplified the budding culture of celebrity that surrounded the musicians, and they used artful photography and really had a big impact in creating the glamour that really still surrounds popular musicians and rock stars to this day. So the original Rolling Stone masthead was designed by Rick Griffin. If you remember a few slides back, he did the flying eyeball. So in the masthead that says Rolling Stone, you can kind of see his hand-drawn typography style. And the photography actually was done by Annie Leibovitz. And if you're into photography, you might recognize her name. She became famous because of this, and she's done hundreds of portraits of famous people throughout her career, usually shooting in black and white. Her captivating images of the musicians really drenched her subjects with a poise that went against their youth and reputation. So kind of made them a little bit more glamorous in that way. And really, initially you can see this magazine cover had that border around it, and it wasn't really until 1981 that they went to more of a full bleed type layout. So in England, Oz magazine featured a wide range of graphic experiments that challenged the notion that clarity must be a designer's primary concern. So they really stopped thinking about this idea of clarity. It was definitely political, so it featured social and political satire, and really took that idea of counterculture, which included opposing the war that was raging in Vietnam at the time. And so Oz magazine was one of the most recognized products of the so-called underground press. And this is one of the covers of the magazine designed by John Goodchild. So you can see it's very Dada, a composition of mismatched type. Images were overprinted upon one another. A lot of images kind of don't really relate. You've got this army guy and the woman in the background. And it was reproduced in beautiful fluorescent ink so that it really appears as if it jumps off the page. This kind of reminds me of Riso printing that is really popular today. And this use of fragments of popular culture outside of their original context is part of the pop art phenomenon. And pop artists really used emotionally charged imagery from popular culture without really commenting on it. Sometimes it was very disjointed, and what this did was sort of allow the viewers to come to their own conclusions about what the pieces were saying. The concoction between graphic design and rock music also played a significant role in pop art graphics. So artists such as Peter Blake, Richard Hamilton, both designed covers for the Beatles. So this is, again, artists as designers in some cases. You can see this cover of the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Band. The band is posed in uniforms made up of psychedelically colored fabric. So this is, again, bringing about pop art ideology, really erasing that distinction between fine art and commercial art in this case. The music industry was not the only patron of this new graphic design style. There was a number of independent graphic design firms that sought out alternatives to the international style, kind of went against that use of grid, structure, sans serif type. And Pushpin Studio was one of these firms. It was very influential in the postmodernist movement. And it was founded by classmate Seymour Schwast Ronald Ruffins, Edward Sorrell, and Milton Glaser. Schwast and Glaser, who really provided much of the artistic direction, channeled their energies into their exploration of a lot of different types of visual artifacts. Their work was really diverse and really became an alternative vision to the rigid rules and principles of the international style. So one of the main strategies pursued by them was to embrace styles that were seen as obsolete. So they would use wood type and Victorian typography and really made people look at them in a new light. This is a cover from, they had a publication called the Pushpin Monthly. And so you can see in this case, they use wooden type and just, playing with it, playing with the size, overlapping things. And really, you kind of recall the Dada publications and really just having fun with the letter form and the design itself. And they really didn't commit to one artistic period. They just really experimented and worked with whatever caught their eye at the time. This is another layout for the Pushpin Monthly. And so you can see random typography, random illustrations, sort of using a grid, but also using humor. So at the time when the international style really kind of represented seriousness, designers at the Pushpin Studios really wanted to start bringing fun and humor into their design work. So in 1969, Seymour Schwast published the issue number 54, which also had sort of these surreal combinations of imagery that they're known for. So really no text on here at all, a lot of imagery. He sought to point out the endemic racism of the U.S. by juxtaposing images of victims of white racial violence with the idealized images of the American South. So still, making sure that their work was politicized and hopefully gaining the attention of the viewer. They also, Milton Glaser was responsible for this beautiful poster for Bob Dylan. You might have recognized this. This is another one that's very iconic. But they really favored illustration as the basis for everything from record covers to posters to corporate identity programs. And they really started introducing styles that became very popular with other designers. This poster for Bob Dylan was an inventive drawing, really capturing the essence of how people felt about Dylan. This Dylan poster, along with Bob Dylan, really became an icon of the rock scene in the 1960s. So this is a poster he did for Olivetti Corporation, which I believe they made typewriters. So he kind of created this medley of an Italian Renaissance painting, used stencil lettering, a faithful dog. And, if you didn't look too closely at this poster, you would really have no idea that this was actually advertising a typewriter until you kind of look down and see that this faithful dog is guarding this beautiful, shiny typewriter. And really, even though it's sort of flat and illustrated and cartoony, you still see this aspect of space and dimension with the beach and the water. And what's really another thing that's kind of interesting is this poster sort of tells a story, which also did not really play a role in the international style. In 1975, Milton Glaser created one of the most familiar American logos of the 20th century, and that was the I Love New York logo. It's actually called a rebus, which is made by combining pictures of objects that viewers interpret as sounds or words, which is, the heart representing love, which adds an element of whimsy to an otherwise unspectacular phrase. So he was commissioned to do this logo because at the time, in the 70s, New York was really a lot of crime. People had a negative opinion of it. So he actually designed the logo free of charge at the request of the New York Commerce Commission as part of their publicity campaign to bring a more positive light into New York City's reputation. So with the new logo, they accomplished something that had never been achieved before. It used graphic design to rebrand New York's image. So if you think about the I Love New York logo, it was reproduced on so many things: billboards, copy mugs, pencils, T-shirts, and really incorporated this flood of like-minded designs. So you have, I love. You've seen this. You've seen this everywhere. People, kind of like the Got Milk campaign, sort of became ubiquitous and used all over the place. The same thing for the I Love New York campaign. So this little logo he designed for free had such a huge impact on New York City. Which brings us to the work of French designer and typography Robert Masson, and he was art director at Editions Gallimard in the 60s and 70s. And he sort of represented an offshoot to the expressive quirkiness of the pushpin style. He produced hundreds of striking designs, but the most daring was the 1964 edition of a play, which is translated to the Bald Soprano. And he was really inspired by the typography of the Futurists and Dada. And the typography is the thing that really shines here, and I'm going to show you this next. The type doesn't complement the image, but serves almost as a character in the play, and you can see this here. So you see that the characters, the men fighting, the women looking on, but really the thing that is the most active on this spread is the typography, which kind of harkens back to Marinetti and Tristan Tzara with the Dada and the concrete poetry. So you're, again, in the postmodernist movement, you're seeing all of these wonderful styles from the 20s, 30s, 40s coming back into designs of the 60s and 70s.